All right. Good evening, everybody. My name is Bob Bruner. I am the exotic forest pest educator with Purdue University's Department of Entomology. And this evening, we're going to be talking a little bit about Multiflora rose. This is one of the more interesting invasive species that we have here in the United States. It has a very long and storied history in both good and bad ways. In modern times, it's hard to see this organism as anything but bad and problematic, especially if you live in areas of Indiana where it's very common, where you have a lot of pasture, or if you have a significant amount of woodlands. However, a lot of folks don't realize is we actually brought this here very intentionally, and it was introduced for a variety of reasons. Originally, it is from areas in Asia, native to Japan, Korea, and China, and I imagine it probably also can be found in several other areas over there. There are a couple of points of introduction for this plant. One of them is that it is used for rootstock, or was used for rootstock for ornamental roses, particularly one cultivated in 1866, due to how showy and how fragrant it is. If you've ever seen a multiflora rose out in the woods, if you're dealing with them right now and you see them bloom, they actually produce a pretty nice smell. That's one point of introduction. The second point is that different universities and government organizations a long time ago would suggest introducing this plant to help assist with erosion control and provide wildlife cover in different areas. Unfortunately, then we didn't realize the exact effect that this organism would have as it began to spread through its non-native territories, and we're dealing with the after effects of that now. Now, a little bit of information, just general biology on this species. It has a few different things that go along with it. So it is a perennial, just like other roses. There is no difference between this rose and other species of roses when you're talking ecologically and biologically. The difference lies in the territory it is most adapted to. A lot of folks don't realize is that since this is a true rose, this was also used to cultivate a lot of rose cultivars that we enjoy right now. If you've ever had polyantha roses, it was created by crossing Rosa chinensis with Rosa multiflora. So this does have a presence in the modern times. You can even find people who specialize in rose cultivation, different greenhouses, who will get special permissions from DNR in different states to be able to cultivate small amounts of these roses so they can do cuttings, graftings, etc. Now, we do allow that in Indiana where you do have to contact DNR, but you are then tightly regulated. You are not able to do anything with that rose that involves putting it outside and planting it in soil in that terms. You are growing it in a greenhouse under very tight restrictions. Now, some of the things about multiflora rose, it typically thrives in area that have well-drained soils. So oftentimes you'll see them appear alongside pastures that are raised above the local area, or you'll see them in woods on hillsides where the water drains really, really well. Unfortunately, they are highly aggressive, as many of us can say. I've seen wooded areas where multiflora rose has grown th so thick you cannot walk through it. Wildlife literally can't get through it. It's like a solid briar wall that takes a significant amount of work to try to bring down. It's able to spread just like other roses do through their seeds. They do produce rose hips, but they also will layer. And I'm going to go into that more in a little bit, but it means that any individual cane, when it touches the ground, can become a new plant. So, a little bit of its effects on pasture management. Here in Indiana, we have a lot of pasture ground, especially in the more central and southern parts of the state. So, this is a constant problem that a lot of our pasture farmers have to deal with. This loves to invade old fields, pastures, roadsides, and of course, forest understory, which is what I specialize in. And pasture kind of sometimes they don't necessarily get mitigated along their edges. There's no treatment. What they're trying to do is develop the internals, and along the fence lines, there's less treatment. Unfortunately, this plant is mostly unpalatable to most livestock species, with one notable exception. You can actually use goats to graze this plant, and they will take it down, and they'll do a pretty good job of it too. I know a lot of farmers will rent out their goats for the purposes of taking down different kinds of invasive plants. Sometimes it can be expensive, especially nowadays, to try to transport those animals. But if you grow goats on your own property, that gives you a potential biocontrol option. The reason that this organism is so difficult in pastures is because one, it will easily outcompete just about any forage species you put up against it. It will take over ground, it will eat up that space. And the other reason is that being a true rose, this is a very thorny plant. I'm sure a lot of you who are out in the woods regularly, you may have walked into one at one point in your life. And I have walked into a few thorns myself, and I swear these have the nastiest that I ever walk into, short of nettles. Like these things just have really sharp thorns, and they are very difficult to grasp. So I kind of brought this up a little bit earlier, or a second ago. Let's talk a little bit about their effects in forested environments. This is where I do most of my work and where I've done a little bit of help with our state parks in trying to map out their infestations of multiflora rose. So the key thing to keep in mind is that multiflora rose is extremely well adapted to survive in poor environments and edge habitats. So what that means is if you are in an environment where very few other things are growing, multiflora rose can move in very easily and take over that space. It also means that if you are at an edge, say where you have a woodlot, the woodlot stops and starts to become some kind of prairie, that edge space where they interface, not many organisms can survive in that space very easily. However, many invasives and native plants are specialized in taking over those spaces, and multiflora rose is no exception. They will take advantage of it and start to grow. When we see them in forests and different kinds of wooded areas, we typically see them in areas where there's an opening in the canopy. When a canopy opening occurs, what we'd like to see are native plants that are meant to be understory plants begin to develop in those spaces. However, if multiflora rose is present, it will just move right in and begin to grow in those areas. And since they grow so quickly and they're able to layer canes over themselves, they create a really good barrier to preventing any other plants from moving in and growing near them, as well as effectively blocking out the ability to move the seeds of any other plant out except for multiflora rose. Now let's see if we can identify these. Now to me, this is the easiest part. I like growing roses at my home, so I'm kind of familiar with a lot of the parts here, but I know some folks may not be. The first step in them is identifying the rose hips or the seed-bearing bodies that a rose has. Essentially, their fruit. This is what happens after blossom. Now, this is a true rose, like I said, so it does produce hips that will last throughout the winter. If you've ever tried to grow roses, most roses, as you may know, they need to be cold stratified in order for the seeds to germinate. Multiflora rose does the same thing. It means that their seeds are really well set to be able to survive our winters, and that is a part of their life cycle. They, in fact, need that to happen. Now, the hip that is produced can persist in the soil for up to 20 years. So consider that for a moment. If you have unmitigated multiflora rose growing in your environment and you've had it produce seed year after year, those seeds can last up to 20 years and you will have a massive seed bank that you'll have to take care of. So it's kind of that first step in understanding how to manage this is getting it when it starts and not waiting on it. Now, as for identification, these rose hips are pretty easy to identify. Let's go back a slide for a minute here. These balloon-like shapes, along with the bright reddish orangish color, is really telltale of multiflora rose. If you want an example of a difference, I grow a hybrid tea rose out in front of my house. Its rose hips are very deep dark red, and they always occur at the same time of year. Multiflora rose will do the same thing, except this color, this brightish reddish orange color, will be visible. Now, as for the canes, this is where they get a little bit different from a lot of rose species. You can kind of see this when you have, say, something like a knockout rose planted on an old property, and the rose is able to keep going even after people move away. So it just gets kind of super bushy, but it doesn't necessarily die in the inside all the way. The canes on a multiflora rose can be huge. So canes can grow up to 6 to 13 feet in length. And the minute a tip touches the soil, it begins a process where that tip will begin to set roots and become a brand new plant. So it basically will clonally develop off of itself. This is that process called layering. This is what produces that gigantic briar wall, and it's also one of the reasons why it's such a pain to get rid of, especially in a forest environment. For example, I know that McCormick's Creek State Park works regularly year after year to try to eliminate as much multiflora rose as they get. And you can find spots of it all over the place where it'll catch at your clothes. There have been a few areas where it will just be so dense you can't get through it. Now, multiflora rose has been worked on heavily in most of our state parks, and they do a great job of eliminating it. It's just, it is a challenging problem to try to deal with. Now, a little bit on the blooms. There's not much we could say here. They're a rose. They will create these really, really nice showy blooms from May through June. We had a question earlier, some of you may have missed, where someone was asking, can they be pink as well as white? And that is yes, absolutely. They can produce white or pink blooms. They're very pretty if you ever see them, and they actually do smell fairly nice. There's a reason why this particular little plant was wanted as a potential hybridization option for creating new types of roses. Unfortunately, it just comes with a really nasty side effect. The blooms are not large. They're fairly small, only 1 to 2 inches in diameter, so they're not going to be as big as some of the old world roses that you may see. And just a little side note here, since I use that term, a lot of New World roses, their genetics are based off of Multiflora rose. They share a common ancestor, and many of them can go back to Multiflora rose. A lot of Old World roses don't necessarily have that, though off the top of my head, I don't recall what their source is. Now, a little bit on the leaves. These look like very typical rose leaves. However, they will leaf out earlier than most species. If you have multiflora rose, the first thing that goes green in your woods is probably going to be that or Asian bush honeysuckle. And it's a very telltale trait of a lot of our invasive species. Now the leaves are going to be pinnate with a toothed edge. So if we go back to this, you could see this is a pinnate leaf. This is not leaves it's not like a bunch of leaves on one little stalk. That is a leaf with several leaflets attached to the stem. They have serrated edges and they are alternate. So if you look closely, while the little leaflets look like they are opposite on their petiole, in fact, the actual full pinnate leaf alternates from the next one on the stem. Another way that you could tell is if you look at the base of each leaf, you could see a small structure at the base of where it attaches. And of course, you could see the thorns in that picture. They may be blocking it a little bit. Now, I am going to try to show you a little bit of the work that I did in McCormick's Creek State Park, helping them map out their multiflora rows that they have. Now, what you are looking at right now is the image taken from a drone flying at about 200 feet above ground level. And what I did is I flew this drone for a period of time in these woods to try to figure out the exact spaces where this was coming through. And I'm going to try to play this video, and it's going to be a little difficult at first, but hopefully it'll work with me. Now, hopefully you are all seeing this go pretty smoothly, but if you look past the tops of the trees, look all the way down to that understory, you can see a lot of green down there. This recording was done at the very beginning of April during 2021, so during the pandemic. We were able to go out there because there's no one else there, and the pandemic made it a little easy to do this kind of work. We didn't have to worry about anybody getting in our way. And I was able to fly around quite a bit of distance. This video is only a short bit of what I was able to see. But anything you see that's green there, we went and we ground truthed everything we looked at, and we found that they were, in fact, multiflora rose. This is, if you're familiar with McCormick's Creek State Park, this is just south of the Wolf Cave Nature Preserve area. You can't fly a drone over a nature preserve, so I had to avoid that as I was doing my work. This is one of my favorite drone images I've ever taken because it really demonstrates just how problematic many of our invasive species can be, because you can tell the trees have not leafed out hardly at all yet. Only a few of them are really working on it. And you could see like there's an evergreen visible there, but anything else that's green, that's the multiflora rose. So hopefully we're all able to see that fairly clearly. Now here it's just one of those images that I took where I'm kind of highlighting this is where the multiflora rose had a particularly dense area in there. And you can see that there are lots of open areas in the canopy that are letting sunlight through. And this invasive is just exploiting that, pushing out any of the potential natives and just outcompeting it completely. And here it's just, again, the trees haven't leafed out yet, so we have even that much more sunlight coming through. Now, the reason that this plant does this is because this is an excellent strategy to do if you are the type of plant that wants to colonize an area. If you were an ecologist, you would refer to this maybe as like propagule rain. It's a fancy term for saying just new colonizers to an area. And what they do is they have a kind of biology that lends itself to being the first in. So what they do is they enter into a new area, they take advantage of poor soils in that area where nothing else can really grow, and then they work on growing as fast as they can to push out everyone else and complete their life cycles either over a longer period of time or complete them faster. Here you could see that multiflora rose and several other invasive plants, they start greening out as early as possible. So in the case of this, the temperature that day was, I think it was below 50 degrees. So they were just going to town regardless of how cold it was. Now, that is not to say that they will start growing super early in super cold temperatures. They just happen to be able to weather those experiences better. Now, a little bit on our control options. This is one that can get a little bit sticky, so bear with me. Like I keep saying, this is a very challenging plant to control. It can regrow from roots, and a lot of folks, when they try to control this plant, they don't account for that. And they will just keep trying to pull it, or maybe just cut it. And then maybe a few months later or less than that, they will have more multiflora rose growing out of that. And as I mentioned earlier, they have a significant seed bank if they've been unmitigated for a long period of time. So even if you do destroy a lot of the multiflora rows, you're going to have more coming back, and then you have to get involved in a several year long project to be able to fully remove it. Oftentimes, these infestations, when they get really severe, they can be really challenging to try to figure out exactly how you're going to go about this because plants that are dense, such as this guy you're looking at here, you're not going to go in there with just a hacksaw and a will to get this done. This is a nasty mess that requires equipment and planning to be able to get started with. So here are some recommendations, starting with mechanical removal. These younger plants that you'll find out in the woods can be much easier to remove, so it's ideal if you get started early. You just want to watch for the thorns. However, a heavy, well-established infestation is going to need equipment. Sometimes you can get through just kind of smaller stands of it that may be full grown with hacksaws, chainsaws, and being careful. But a lot of times the root systems are so dug in, you're going to need something like a front loader or a tractor with a chain or even a backhoe, depending on how bad the infestation is. Because you want to make sure you get rid of all of that root system. Now, one of the recommendations that several universities put out there is that you can control multiflora rows through mowing. Now, this is younger populations. These are not fully grown. What you saw on the last slide is not a great example of something to try to mow. If you mow at least 3 to 6 times throughout a season, you can actually reduce those populations because now you're costing that plant. Yeah, you haven't pulled the root system, but you're now forcing it to try to regrow the parts it lost. It doesn't have great photosynthesis until it can leaf out, and then it just can't restore the energy that you took from it. So if you keep mowing it year after year, you will eventually win that fight. Now, that works great if you're on a pasture. That does not work great if you're in the middle of the woods because you're not getting your lawnmower up there to try to handle this or any kind of blade arm or anything like that. Now, chemical removal becomes the primary option for a lot of the nastier infestations. One thing before I dig into this, there are biocontrol options that I mentioned earlier, such as using goats to graze, and there is also a disease that can attack multiflora rose. Well, there are a few diseases that can, but the one that I'm referring to here is something called rose rosette disease. Some of you may have heard of it referred to as witch's broom. You'll see the plant get very spindly. You'll see the leaves start to kind of wick out into a funny shape. That's that witch's broom. And they'll go kind of deep, dark red. And then after suffering from the disease for about a year or two, the plants will eventually die all the way down to the roots. Right now, there isn't, as far as I am aware, any kind of project or system by which you can infect multiflora rows. Most likely, that's a piece of research that's ongoing. However, I do know that using goats for feeding is something that is regularly done in Indiana and other states as well. Now, if you don't feel like that those are options for you, there are also ways to control this chemically. Unfortunately, this is one of the nastier ones because oftentimes you'll be spraying chemicals when there are other plants present that you don't want to affect. Now, first rule of trying to spray these things or use any chemical on them is mow the plants. You will stress those plants, you'll make it harder for them to be able to survive what's coming next, and it will make your job much, much easier. It'll also reduce the surface area that you need to treat. And if you reduce that surface area, you'll reduce your chances of hitting a non-target plant. Now, there are several pesticides. I almost said insecticides there. There are several pesticides that do work well with multiflora rows, including glyphosate, triclopyr with 2,4-D, metsulfuron, and metsulfuron with 2,4-D, dicamba, imazapyr, pichlorum, and aminopyralid. Those are a lot of very fancy words. There are a variety of brands that will carry these kinds of products. I am not allowed to recommend any one product to you. That's not what I do. I can just tell you the chemicals that work on this one, and I'm happy to share with you additional information later on if you want to get an idea of what brands you could potentially look at and other things like that. I just don't have enough slides to show you all of them here. Now, what you want to do is when you do plan to do an application, you want to do it with timing in mind. There are certain times of the year where different applications are going to work better. Now, starting with a foliar application, what you can do is cut the plants and then wait for them to start developing back to about knee level. The plants are going to be stressed at that point and they're going to be small still, so that way you can go ahead and treat them effectively. You don't want to do a foliar application after cutting them because obviously there's no foliage and you're not going to be hitting much of the plants there at all. So you want to make sure they get some leaves back on them before you treat them. Just don't wait more than that. Now, foliar applications can be done anytime during a season. You just have to be aware of the risk that if you are doing a foliar application, that means you are spraying and your potential for hitting a non-target plant is going to be high. That's just an unavoidable fact of life there. What we do recommend, however, is that oftentimes earlier in the spring, when the plants begin leafing out, may be an ideal time to begin hitting them because then you will have fewer plants nearby that you could potentially damage. Now, cut stem and basal bark treatments are the other options when it comes to treating these plants with different pesticides. You have a choice of using either a water-based or oil-based solution. If you go with water-based, you're looking at using something like glyphosate or triclopyr at a 1-to-1 ratio. And if it's water-based, that is where you want to use it immediately after cutting the plants. That way, you're taking advantage of the fact that the plant is still moving liquids and nutrients around its systems, and it'll transport the herbicide really, really well. Oil-based solutions, however, can be done at any time. They will sink into the tissues of the plant. So if you want to do that kind of oil-based treatment, you are looking at doing that in the late fall. That way you can apply it, everything else around them is going to be dormant, and the stuff sticks to the plants real well. When you do your treatments, you're either doing it directly on that cut stem, or you've scraped away bark and you've done a coating around that area where you've scraped the bark away. Now, this is just a little bit more on that recommended timing, kind of bringing it all together. So foliar, you can treat from early spring, as long as the plants are leafed out, all the way to the onset of fall colors. The plants will remain green that entire time. In fact, they will almost certainly be the last green thing before all the other everything goes into full dormancy. Basal bark and cut stem can be done year round, but I feel like these are done best sort of in the late fall. That way you are being very, very careful about treating anything off target. And you can guarantee, like if you use the oil-based solution, it's going to go in that plant and it has plenty of time to get in there, and you don't have to worry about acting immediately after cutting it. I kind of made my last point there. Herbicide application is effective just after leaf out and late fall. Basal bark is normally the most recommended treatment option.